ever feel like we're just kind of, I don't know, scratching the surface of what we can really know? Like how much of what we perceive is actually out there in the world versus just our brains trying to make sense of things?
Right.
That's exactly the kind of mind-bending question Kant tackled in his Critique of Pure Reason.
It's a big one.
You guys sent this one in, and let me tell you, it's dense. So buckle up, because we're about to go deep on some seriously big ideas.
Yeah. What's remarkable is that Kant, he wasn't just philosophizing in a vacuum here.
Yeah.
He was responding to some of the philosophical heavyweights of his time, people like Leibniz and Wolff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They were all about using logic, pure reason to get to the truth of things, analyzing concepts, that sort of thing.
Right, right.
But Kant, he comes along and says, hold on a minute. Like, what if, right?
Right.
What if the way we even think about the world, the way our minds are structured, what if that's actually shaping what we believe to be true?
Okay, so he's shaking things up right from the start. I can definitely see why this book is considered such a game changer. But before we get too far, maybe we could back up a bit and talk about some of those core concepts that Kant wrestles with.
Sure.
One that jumped out at me, and I think it's kind of foundational to everything else, is this idea of intuition versus concepts.
Right. So for Kant, it's not enough to just have sensory experiences, right?
Yeah.
Like seeing a tree, hearing a bird sing.
Right.
Our minds, they don't just sort of passively absorb that information. For him, our minds have to actively organize those sensations into thoughts, into concepts.
Okay.
So tree isn't just this jumble of green and brown shapes and textures that your eyes are seeing.
Yeah.
It becomes the concept of tree with all of its associated qualities.
Yeah.
Trunk, branches, leaves.
Right, the things that make a tree a tree.
Yeah, you got it.
So it's like our minds are actively constructing our understanding of the world, not just passively receiving information, like you were saying.
That's a great way to put it.
And this leads to that other really, I don't know, juicy, maybe Kantian concept, which is phenomena versus noumena, right?
Exactly, and this is a big one.
Yeah.
So phenomena, those are the appearances, right? It's what we perceive with our senses, filtered through those concepts we were just talking about.
Okay.
But the noumena, the thing in itself, as Kant calls it, the true essence of the tree, like what it actually is beyond our experience, that's something that Kant argues we can never truly know.
Wow. Okay, so even with all of our reasoning power, our intellect, there's this fundamental limit to what we can actually access.
That's the crux of it, yeah.
A bit of a head scratcher.
And to understand how he gets there, we have to dig into his ideas about judgments. Specifically, this distinction he makes between analytic judgments versus synthetic judgments.
Okay.
So analytic judgments, they're kind of like taking something apart to understand its parts.
Okay.
Like all bachelors are unmarried.
Yeah.
We're not really adding any new information there. We're just kind of unpacking a concept that's already there.
Right. It's built into the definition.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But synthetic judgments, those are the really interesting ones. Those are the judgments that actually bring in new information, new knowledge into the equation.
Like, this coffee is strong. I'm adding something new to my understanding of that particular cup of coffee.
Exactly. That's a great example. And for Kant, synthetic judgments are really the key to expanding our knowledge of the world.
Okay.
But, and this is the really important part, even those synthetic judgments, they're limited by how our minds are structured, by those kind of inborn ways of perceiving the world.
Oh, okay.
Like, imagine you're trying to understand how a computer program works, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But you're stuck only looking at the user interface. The screen, the icons.
Right, you can't see the code.
You can never actually see the code underneath, the actual nuts and bolts of how it's all working.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
Mm-hmm.
But if our experience of reality is kind of like interacting with that user interface, what's going on behind the scenes? How does Kant explain these limitations?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and where things might start to sound a little strange at first.
Okay.
Because Kant says that those limitations, they're not coming from the outside, they're coming from within us.
From within us?
Yeah, from the structure of our own minds. And specifically, he points to space and time as being key to this whole thing.
Okay, so space and time, these fundamental aspects of reality, are not actually out there like we tend to think.
You got it. And that's where things start to get really mind-blowing.
Exactly. This is one of Kant's most, I don't know about you, but I think most radical ideas, right? We tend to think about space and time as this kind of fixed background, this container for everything that exists, right?
Yeah, it's just there.
But Kant says, nope, Not so fast. They're not objective realities out there. He says they're actually structures that are built into how our minds work.
Okay, hold on. I need a minute to like really wrap my head around this. So it's like our brains come pre-programmed with space and time, and that shapes how we experience everything. That's the gist of it, yeah. Kant argues that space and time, they're not these things independent of us, but rather they're the lens through which we perceive the world.
You know what helped me kind of get this whole space as a mental structure
Hmm.
thing? There's this example in the text. It talks about like your left and right hands, right?
Okay.
They're the same shape, but you can't, like, no matter what you do, you can't flip one to perfectly match the other. A left hand will never become a right hand.
That's a great example. It gets at how our very perception of space is like pre-wired into us,
Yeah.
right? Like we can't even imagine a space where a left hand could be flipped to become a right hand.
So our minds are already like imposing this structure of space onto our experience. And if space and time aren't actually out there, but in here, does that mean that we're like trapped? Like we're stuck experiencing reality through these mental filters?
In a way, yes. We're limited to experiencing the phenomena, right? The appearances of things. Those appearances are shaped by our minds, shaped by those mental filters of space and time. But the true nature of reality, that thing in itself, the noumena, that remains always beyond our grasp.
It's both fascinating and kind of frustrating, you know? Like we can understand it intellectually, but our brains are still going to keep experiencing the world in this like very structured way.
Exactly. But, that's part of what makes it so, I think, so profound, is that, like, understanding those limitations is a huge part of what makes Kant's work so important.
Okay, I'm with you. So we've kind of established that our minds structure experience with space and time, but how do we go from just experiencing to actually forming thoughts, concepts, judgments about those experiences?
Right.
How do we go from seeing, I don't know, a car driving down the street to thinking car driving street and understanding what that all means?
That's where things get even more intriguing. This is where he introduces these things that he calls categories. These are like these fundamental rules of thought that our minds use to organize all those sensations and perceptions that we're constantly bombarded with. Right.
So these categories, they're like the, I don't know, the software that our brains are running to make sense of the world.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. These are, we're talking about big categories like substance and causation, reality. Like the really like fundamental building blocks of how we understand things exist, how events unfold in time, how we distinguish between what's real and what's not.
Right. But those categories, I mean, they seem really abstract, right? Like, how do they actually play out in those concrete, real world situations like that car driving down the street that I was just talking about? Like, how does my brain connect this abstract idea of causation to, like, understanding that somebody pressing on a gas pedal leads to a car moving forward?
Now you're getting to like the heart of it, right? This is where one of Kant's most challenging, but also I think most rewarding concepts comes into play. And that's this idea of schematism.
Schematism. Okay, now I'm really lost.
It sounds more complicated than it is, I promise.
Okay.
So think of schematism as this kind of bridge between those abstract categories we were just talking about, right? Like substance causation.
Okay.
It's with a bridge between those and our actual concrete lived experience in time. It's the process by which our minds can take those really big kind of abstract concepts and actually apply them to those specific events and things that we encounter in the world.
So it's like schematism is how we go from this really general idea that like things have causes to that specific action caused that specific outcome.
You got it. You're getting it. Let me give you an example, right?
Okay.
Straight from Kant, because I think it's helpful.
Okay, yeah.
He says that the schema of cause and effect, right? There's a big one. He says that it is the real upon which, whenever it is posited, something else always follows. So it's like, it's this rule, right? It's this mental rule that helps us understand how events unfold in time, how one thing can lead to another.
Okay, so like when I see that car driving down the street, what my brain is doing is it's using that scheme of causation to connect like the driver's foot pressing the gas pedal to the car moving forward.
Exactly.
It's like my mind is saying, okay, based on what I understand about how cause and effect works, that's what's making that car move.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it applies to all sorts of things. When you see a ball roll after it's been kicked, your mind is connecting those two events using that schema of causation. It's how we make sense of the world as this kind of like chain of causes and effects happening in time.
Man, this is so intricate. It's like we're really like pulling back the curtain on the inner workings of our minds here and seeing all the machinery that makes it possible for us to even like think and understand in the first place. But, it seems like all this talk about reason, categories, schematism, it kind of, I don't know, it makes me wonder, can our own ability to reason, can it lead us down some confusing paths?
That's a great question. And that's exactly where Kant goes next. He argues that when we try to take reason beyond the realm of our experience, when we try to apply it to those ultimate questions about, like, the universe as a whole, we inevitably run into contradictions. He
Yeah.
calls these antinomies.
Antinomies. Okay, I think I need a little bit more on that. Like, what does he mean by contradictions in this case?
Yeah, so a good example of this is, the classic question of whether the universe has a beginning, right?
Mhm.
Or if it's always existed. Kant shows how you can actually build equally compelling arguments for both sides.
Oh, yeah, the classic, did time have a start, brain melter.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right.
Oh,
On the one hand, we have this idea that everything must have a cause, right?
Yeah.
So logically, it would seem like the universe must have had a cause too, some beginning point.
yeah,
But then you run into this problem of, well, what caused that first cause, right?
right, right. It's like that thing, when we were kids, like, what's the highest number? And it's like, a million, a billion. And it's like, well, there's always a bigger number. You can always keep going.
Exactly. It creates this infinite regress, this never-ending chain of causes that our minds, they kind of bump up against and can't really fully grasp. And that's just one example. Kant goes on to describe these antinomies related to whether the universe is finite or infinite, whether everything is made of simple parts or composite parts.
Wow.
I mean, he even talks about the existence of God as one of these antinomies.
So are we just like stuck then? Are we doomed to just endlessly debate these questions without ever really arriving at like a satisfying answer?
Well, not necessarily. Kant wouldn't say that reason is useless. It's not like we should just give up on reason entirely. It's just that, just like with those categories of space and time, there are limits to what we can know through pure reason alone.
So it's not about giving up on reason, but it's about understanding that it has a jurisdiction. And outside of that jurisdiction, we might be getting into some trouble.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
But how do we know where that line is? How do we keep ourselves from falling into these traps of thinking that we can just reason our way to the ultimate truth about these really big questions?
Well, that's where Kant introduces this idea of transcendental illusion, which I know sounds like a mouthful.
Oh boy. Here come the big words again. Transcendental illusion. Lay it on me.
Okay, think of it this way. Imagine you're driving through the desert on a scorching hot day.
Right.
You're parched, you're desperate for water.
Okay, I'm with you.
And in the distance, you see this shimmering pool of water.
Ooh, yeah.
It looks so real, so inviting.
Your brain is like oasis. Water.
Exactly. Your mind, desperate for relief, it interprets that shimmer as a real oasis.
Right?
But if you get closer and closer, that oasis, it disappears. It was just a trick of the light, a mirage.
Right. Okay, I get the analogy. But how does that relate to, transcendental illusions?
So just like that mirage tricks your eyes, right?
Right.
Transcendental illusions, they trick our minds.
Okay.
They're these seemingly logical conclusions that we might arrive at about things that are ultimately beyond the realm of our possible experience. We think we're seeing something real, something true, but in reality, it's just our minds, like kind of projecting those categories and concepts onto something where they don't really apply.
So when we try to reason about those really big questions, like the ultimate nature of the universe, the existence of God, even something like the beginning of time, are we essentially like chasing mirages in a philosophical desert?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
But it's not that those questions are meaningless or that we should stop asking them. It's just that we need to be aware of how easily our own minds can kind of like lead us astray.
Okay.
Project those mirages onto this kind of vast unknown desert of what lies beyond our experience.
That's a really powerful image. But if we're kind of like hardwired to see these mirages, to bump up against these limits, then how do we keep from getting stuck? What's the point of engaging with this kind of philosophical thinking at all if it's just going to lead to these dead ends?
Now you're getting to the heart of why Kant's work is still so relevant, even centuries after he wrote it.
Okay.
And that's something that we're going to dive into right after we take a quick break.
All right, so we've established there are some pretty serious limits to what we can actually know, even with all our fancy reasoning abilities. But how does that knowledge, or I guess, lack of knowledge actually help us? Like, why does any of this matter when it comes to just, living our lives out here in the world?
Well, you've hit on why Critique of Pure Reason isn't just some dusty old philosophy book, right?
Right.
It's a call to rethink not just what we know, but how we know and what we do with that knowledge.
So it's less about the answers and more about, like, the process of asking the questions, right?
Exactly. Kant helps us see that knowledge, it isn't just about, piling up facts.
Right.
It's about understanding the whole framework, the structure within which those facts even make sense in the first place.
Okay.
Like, imagine you're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, right?
Yeah.
But you don't realize that you're missing the outer frame.
Oh, okay.
You might be able to connect some of the pieces,
Right.
but the overall picture, it's always going to be incomplete and
Yeah.
even distorted,
And those missing puzzle pieces, that frame, that's kind of like the limits of reason that we've been talking about with Kant, right?
Exactly. He's saying, look, your mind, it's not just this passive observer. It's an active participant in creating your reality.
Right.
You've got these built-in filters, those categories, the way you perceive space and time. And those filters, they influence everything you experience and think you understand.
Yeah, it's humbling, but then at the same time, it's kind of empowering too, right?
I think so.
Like, yeah, on the one hand, we've got to acknowledge the limits of our own perception. But on the other hand, knowing about those limitations gives us like a whole new level of understanding about how we see the world, how we make sense of it.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Recognizing those limits, it doesn't have to lead to, like, skepticism or despair.
Right.
Kant would say, if anything, it's the opposite.
Okay.
By acknowledging the limits of pure reason, what we're doing is we're opening ourselves up to these other ways of
Yeah.
knowing and experiencing the world, right?
Okay.
Faith, intuition, art, morality, all of those aspects of what it means to be human, they kind of transcend pure logic.
So it's not about saying, like, we can't know anything for sure, but rather, hey, let's be aware of the tools we're using to understand things, right?
Yes.
And let's not be afraid to use different tools for different tasks.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, good.
It's like, if all you have is a hammer, you're going to treat every problem like a nail.
Right,
But-
right.
But if you've got a whole toolbox, screwdrivers, wrenches, you name it, then you can be a little more creative, a little more effective in how you approach things.
Yeah, I love that. And in this case, those tools, they're not just these abstract philosophical concepts, right? They're
Mhm.
about how we show up in our everyday lives, how we make decisions, how we treat other people, the things that really matter, how we find meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And I think even though he might not have said it in these exact words, Kant's work, it really points toward this idea of living a life that's both, intellectually rigorous and deeply human at the same time.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging those limitations while also embracing the mystery and the wonder of what lies beyond them.
It's a lot to think about. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of Kant's ideas here.
Always more to explore.
Always more to explore, which I kind of like, right? It's like this never-ending journey of discovery and recognizing that sometimes what we don't know is just as important, maybe even more important than what we do know.
Totally.
So, listener, we hope this deep dive into Kant has sparked your curiosity and given you plenty to ponder.
Lots to chew on.
Remember, that journey of trying to understand the world, it's just as important as actually arriving at the destination. And sometimes realizing what we don't know can be just as valuable as what we do know. So until next time, keep asking those big questions. Keep diving deep.